Hello and welcome to Semi Mac Politics with me, Mr MacLellan. For this video we are going to focus on the advantages and disadvantages of primaries, that process by which the candidate for a particular party is chosen as the nominee to become president. We are obviously going to focus on the Republican and Democrat parties because the United States has that two-party system. However, other third parties, they also hold primary contests. So it is very much an embedded aspect of US political culture. They are state-based intra-party elections. So each state has their own laws to administer these primary contests. And that gives an awful lot of variability between states. The way the contest is conducted in, say, South Carolina is going to be different to the way it's conducted in California, and so on and so forth. So a very complex picture when it comes to actually navigating the primaries process. The aim for any candidate is to win pledged delegates. So if you manage to secure those so-called committed delegates, they will go on to vote for you at the National Nomination Convention. So it's all about accruing as high a number of delegates as you possibly can. Delegates are awarded on a winner-takes-all or a more proportional basis. It should be noted that the Democrat Party go in for the proportional basis completely, whereas the Republicans, they also have this hybrid of winner-takes-all or awarding delegates on that proportional basis. Again, it adds to the complexity of navigating the primaries process. Most states choose to hold primary elections as part of the primaries process. The clue is in the name, the primaries. They are therefore heavily made up of primary elections. And they're really straightforward. You simply put an X in the box next to your chosen candidate, whether it be for the Republican or Democratic Party, wander into some sort of civic centre like a school and drop your ballot paper into the ballot box ready for counting. And from there, an eventual winner can be decided and delegates are awarded to the candidates respectively based on their vote. In contrast though, we also have caucuses, although it should be noted that there are a reducing number of caucuses, and that speaks of the fact that the caucus process is time-consuming, it's logistically complicated. It is in essence a political gathering where various speeches are delivered and therefore people vote following the listening to of those speeches. It takes a long time. A number of logistical challenges are involved in that particular process, and for that reason the number of caucuses are dwindling. And to highlight that, in 2016 the Democrats held 14 caucuses, so they were already in the minority, but that went down to just 3 in 2020. And the Republican Party, which traditionally speaking has held more caucuses in comparison to the Democrat Party, however, in 2016 they held 13 caucuses, again in the minority, but that has dwindled right down to 5 in 2020. So the caucus process really is on the way out as part of this wider, broader primaries contest. There are 3 types of primary, or indeed 3 types of caucus: open, closed, or semi-closed, or also known as modified. So when it comes to closed primaries, that allows registered voters for only one particular party to take part. So for example, if you're a registered Republican, you can take part in a closed primary, but registered Democrats cannot. Open primaries, now that is where you have registered voters either for the Democrats or for the Republicans. They are able to take part in any party's contest, whether it be Democrat or Republican. However, it should be noted that you can only take part in one contest. So if you're a registered Democrat or a registered Republican, you got to choose which party's contest you're actually going to take part in. Then we have semi-closed or modified primaries. That allows registered voters for a particular party to take part in those contests, but also independents as well. So you want to try and engage people who are recognised as independents. They are a key voting bloc because, of course, they're persuadable much more than Democrat or Republican registered voters. So they're the 3 different types of primary, I should say. And again, just to emphasise, adds to the complexity of this process, the different types, closed, open, or indeed modified primaries. Now, the key question really you're going to be asked about primaries or caucuses on an A-level exam, and more broadly speaking, it is the advantages and the disadvantages of the contest. So we're going to look at that particular aspect of the primaries process, and then we're going to finish off with looking at some possible reforms. It would be wrong, of course, to effectively slate the primaries process by looking at the disadvantages without suggesting any possible alternatives. So that's what we're going to do just to finish. So in terms of advantages, well, they do increase political participation. Turnout has actually increased since the modern era of the primaries, and I will talk you through the context by which we really use the phrase the modern era of the primaries in just a second. But to focus on the increase in turnout, there was an 11% turnout in 1968. That was under the old process, but now in the modern era, that reached a high of 30% in 2008. And that has to be a good thing. You're getting ordinary voters to engage in the chosen candidate for either the Democrat or Republican parties. They are essentially a form of direct democracy. And now we've got to be a little bit careful with that phrase, because voters, they do choose who they want the Republican or Democratic candidate to be, but in fact what they're choosing is the number of delegates that will be awarded to that particular candidate. And it's those delegates who, because they're committed and pledged, should vote for the particular chosen candidate from a state. Now, because you're using the delegates as a middleman, that, strictly speaking, does not make it a form of direct democracy. However, because they are pledged or committed delegates, they should vote according to the wishes of the voters of that state. So, strictly speaking, not a form of direct democracy, but essentially it is. Hence, I've included that word essentially in inverted commas, if you like. So just take that with a bit of a pinch of salt, but I think the reality really does reflect that it is a form of direct democracy. I'm straining a little bit as I use that phrase because there is a caveat to that. However, I think you can get away with using that phrase if you just put it into context, qualify it with that word essentially, and you'll be able to get away with it. They are no longer, therefore, the candidates chosen in these so-called smoke-filled rooms. So it's not the case that party bosses, the party elite with their fat cigars, if you like, in the pre-reform days, and by pre-reform I'm looking at the year 1972, the candidate really was chosen by a small elite of the Republican and Democratic parties. That has been done away with, and arguably that is a good thing. Ordinary voters now get the choice as to who the Republican or Democrat Party candidate is going to be for president. And it comes to these McGovern-Fraser reforms. Following the disastrous 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, the McGovern-Fraser Committee was introduced to look at the Democratic Party process when it came to selecting their presidential candidate. The Republicans have eventually followed suit and really mirrored the process to a certain extent that the Democrats have employed, and that did away with the so-called smoke-filled rooms of party elite exerting their influence, and now the power is in the hands of ordinary voters. Has to be a good thing because it does encourage grassroots democracy. Democracy, in essence, is a good thing, particularly if you're in that democratic culture that we have in the West. And to encourage grassroots democracy to such an extent by employing ordinary voters to choose a party candidate has to be a good thing, surely. Caucus contests, I know there is a dwindling number of them, as I previously cited, but they are politically stimulating environments. Nevada is one state which holds a caucus, both for the Democrats and the Republicans. There is Iowa, of course, and we'll mention Iowa in just a second, but they are politically stimulating events. I don't see how you can't get engaged or indeed just a little bit excited by attending a caucus process, even though it may be one for the political geeks, if you like, those people who really have their finger on the pulse of politics in the US. They tend to turn up. However, there is an element of intrigue and excitement that takes place in those contests. So, gotta be a good thing if you're happy to give up the time to engage politically at a caucus contest. There is a wide choice of candidates, and that speaks of pluralist democracy. Any democracy which is going to function properly has to embed the essence of pluralism, many competing voices, and that should be encouraged, and that's highlighted by the wide choice of candidates in a primaries process. As an example, in 1968's pre-reform era, there were only 5 Republican and Democratic candidates to become the US president. However, in 2020, there were 16 Republican and Democratic candidates, and increased significantly. And that's fairly common to get that wide field of candidates. I know I've just plucked out one number from the most recent 2020 election, but it's fairly common now to get a relatively large number of candidates, and therefore you have that choice. Also, outsider candidates can build momentum. This is a long process. There are going to be many ups and downs in that process, but because of that, if you have a setback, particularly if you're an outsider candidate, you're likely to get setbacks. You're likely to face some negativity by being someone who has little name recognition, arguably little political experience, but you've got time to build that and to counteract those accusations. And 2 people who did that so well: Barack Obama in 2008, just a one-term senator, billed himself as an outsider candidate, and I think to a large extent he was, but he was able to build that key momentum that you need to win states, or at least pick up as many delegates as you can, and people then start to talk about you, the money rolls in, you get that media attention as well. And we've also got Jimmy Carter in 1976. People actually, when they heard Jimmy Carter's name in 1976 during the nomination process, would retort, "Jimmy who?" He was that unknown. He actually used that rather effectively by putting out published material saying, "My name is Jimmy Carter." So he kind of stood up and confronted that particular slight against his name, or the lack of name recognition that he had, and he went on to win. He was, again, of someone of relatively little political experience, just being a one-term governor of the state legislature of Georgia. Okay, just shows that any peanut farmer that he was could come from nowhere and go on to become US president. Gives hope to us all, if you like. Unsuitable candidates, in contrast, are weeded out in the process. And a rather kind of overt example of this is Gary Hart in 1988. Oh, Gary, why would you put yourself up for high political office with all the publicity that entails, when at the same time you have been found to be committing adultery and you are a married man? Gary, what are you doing? That's what happened to him. It trashed his campaign, and that's got to be a good thing. He didn't make it into the White House because arguably he wasn't suitable, and the primary process shone that light on his particular affair. Regional popularity is revealed as a result of the primaries process. So the fact that you've got to do well, or as well as you can at least, in as many states as possible, that's going to show that are you going to win in the Northeast, in New England states? Are you going to win in the coastal areas? How are you going to perform in the Midwest? How are you going to perform in the Deep South? These are different states with different political landscapes, and you need as wide as attraction, if you like, to voters as is possible. And just to highlight that, Wyoming, thought to be one of the most conservative states in the Union, is very different to Vermont, one of the most liberal, if not the most liberal state in the United States. So which candidate is going to have regional appeal, cross-state border appeal? Because that's going to stand you in good stead if you then make it to the actual presidential ballot come the November of a presidential election year. Smaller states, they front load to increase their influence. So you've got to think of a big calendar that's going to be filled with all the dates for a particular state's contest. Now, the smaller states, they often don't get much political attention. You cannot always win that many delegates from a particularly small state because they tend to be thrashed out, the delegates, and divvied out according to the number of people who live in an actual state. So what the smaller states do is they want to get their contest early on in the process, because if you're early on in the process, early on in that calendar, you are going to get more attention regarding your influence, if you like, and how you can shape the political race as part of the primaries process. So you try and get your contest to the front of the calendar. That's known as front loading, to try and increase the emphasis and importance and influence given to your state. If you do well as a candidate in the early stage, you start to build that momentum. So it's all about having a good start, as good a start as you can possible. Get your contest as a state early on, you increase your influence. And to highlight that, Iowa and New Hampshire, well, they've got relatively small populations, less than 1% of the US population in both Iowa and New Hampshire. Just to put that in a little bit of context, when you look at the population figures for all the US 50 states, they do tend to have a population of around about 1%, 2%, 3%. So the population is quite widespread in the United States, but it does emphasize that with Iowa and New Hampshire each having less than 1% of the US population, they are not populous states. They don't tend to get much of a political focus for the 4 years of a presidential term until the primary process kicks in. Iowa is the first contest, it's the caucus, tends to be in January, if not early February. New Hampshire then is the first primary. And they both actually have passed state laws saying that they have to be first. New Hampshire states, their state law, that they have to be the first primary, and that therefore does allow Iowa to get away with being the first contest. It gives them a sense of real self-political importance. 50 states can take part in the process. US citizens abroad even have a primary contest, if you like, and they can take part, and delegates are awarded to those guys who live overseas. The US territories, rather significantly, can take part. So places like Puerto Rico, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, I'm sure there's one or two that I'm missing, but anyway, the US territories, they can take part. And the reason why that's important is because they can't actually take part in the US presidential contest proper in the November. So a real contradiction, if you like. They are US citizens in the US territories, but they cannot take part in the presidential election come November. But they can take part in the primaries process, and delegates are awarded to those territories. So it gives them a sense, again, of political self-importance. So there are a lot of advantages there, a lot to speak of in terms of what is good about the primaries process, and I don't think there's much of an argument to go back to the early 1970s days, before the McGovern-Fraser reforms, to go towards the old system of the so-called party bosses in smoke-filled rooms. Without further ado though, let's get on to the disadvantages of the process. It is very lengthy, and in terms of the 2020 contest, this first primary, or rather I should say caucus, it would have been Iowa, was on the 3rd of February, and the last one was in Delaware on the 11th of July. That's around about a 6 months process. Chuck in there as well the invisible primary, that indeterminate period of time when candidates are actually preparing to run and to put themselves forward as a presidential candidate, and you start to realise this is a long and arduous process. And many candidates, many people just will think, I don't want to touch that process with a barge pole, given its length, its complexity, its heartache. Yes, it does require stamina, it will test the candidates, but almost to a fault, because it is so long. Always makes me think as well, if you are maybe a senator or a governor, a city mayor even, looking to put yourself forward for a presidential run, what are you going to do about your day job? Because you already hold political office. You are surely going to ignore, to a large extent, your day job. And is that a good thing? Not necessarily so. They are, given its length, prohibitively expensive. Money talks in US politics. I'm sure you know that. You've got to pay to play. And since 29th of February, sorry, just to kind of, I missed one out there, didn't I? On the 29th of February, so at the end of February, Joe Biden in 2020 had raised $134 million. Trump had raised $178 million. Astronomical sums of money, and against that context, most people look at this process and think, oh, I don't want to go anywhere near that. And even if I did want to go near that, I don't have the business or the political connections to raise that level of finance, which is somewhat of a shame. So it really does exclude many people, given how expensive it is. Insider candidates do often win. So we talked about outsider candidates like Obama, like Carter, can actually achieve the nomination, but more often than not, insider candidates do win. Since 1968, 7 vice presidents, so those people who had served in office as the vice president, then put themselves for a presidential run and achieve the nomination for either the Democrats or Republicans. So it includes people like Richard Nixon, Al Gore, Walter Mondale. They all served as a vice president and then put together a presidential run, and they became the nominee for their respective party. So it does favour the insider candidates as connected with the amount of money that they have to raise and spend to do well. It is a media-dominated beauty contest. So if you want to look at it cynically and the role of the media, it really does dominate the process, turning it into somewhat of a beauty contest style over substance. And that leads to the argument, should we not just leave it to the professionals, the professional hacks, the professional party bosses to choose a suitable presidential candidate? It will take away the style aspect of the race to a large extent. And actually these professional politicians, they know what it takes to run for the presidency. They know what it takes to be a successful presidential candidate and also to be a successful president. Just because you're good in front of the media doesn't necessarily make you suitable to be a president. But there isn't so much that focus because of the media-dominated nature of the primaries process. Democrats have super delegates. So super delegates are so-called unpledged delegates. There's around about 700 of them in 2020. That represents 16% of the total number of delegates in the Democrat Party, and it is an attempt by the Democrats to exert some level of hierarchical control as to who their chosen candidate is going to be. But you could make an argument that that 16% figure just isn't enough. There aren't enough super delegates to mean that the party hierarchy can have a significant influence on the person and indeed the race as to who is going to become the candidate. And because it's a figure that's really neither here nor there, it's too low for them to have a significant effect, then it is an affront to democracy. Why have them if they're not going to be influential? And there's very little evidence that they have been. Maybe arguably in 2008 between Obama and Clinton, they were thought to have some sort of an influence, but mainly speaking, the superdelegates for the Democrats, they're uncommitted, but they've never swung the race significantly. And therefore, what is the point in having them? They're an affront to the democratic nature of the primaries process. We can hardly say it is a function of direct democracy when these superdelegates exist. Just get rid of them, so the argument would go. Some states as well have an undue influence. So we've talked about the influence of smaller states like Iowa and New Hampshire in particular. As a kind of contrast to that, Florida, which isn't a small state in the United States necessarily, they do have political clout, Floridians. However, in order to increase their political clout during the nomination process, they tried to front load their contest so it became earlier in the primaries calendar. But they did that without the authorization of the Democratic National Committee, without the authorization of the DNC. I can understand why Florida did it. They wanted to increase their influence, politically speaking, but they didn't get that authorization and they were punished by the DNC, and effectively their number of delegates was cut by half. Each delegate was worth 0.5 of a vote. Look at it another way, the number of delegates was cut by 50% at the National Nomination Convention. So some states do have that undue influence, and it's really having the knock-on effect of other states scrambling to get influence, but that causes problems in itself. So maybe we should think of a system that does away with the undue influence of smaller states, and we'll come on to that when we look at the reforms just towards the end. The primaries process and the contest, they are absolutely fierce, and because of that you could argue that they are acts of political self-harm. Because they are intra-party contests, you have bites being taken out of opposing candidates, chunks being taken out of them, as the colleagues within the Democrat and Republican parties, the political colleagues, they absolutely tear shreds of each other. They are in a fierce political rivalry to achieve the nomination for the Democrat or Republican parties. And we've got some examples here of really politicians slugging it out to try and achieve this nomination when they should be working together within the same party. But in 1992, George Bush Sr. versus Pat Buchanan, fiercely competitive nomination battle, and it really did fall, to a certain extent, George Bush. Now, George Bush did win the nomination, and he faced off against Bill Clinton in the presidential contest in 1992. But Pat Buchanan really did land some important blows on George Bush Sr. He was a sitting president, and during his presidency, George Bush Sr. had uttered the remark, "Read my lips, no increase in taxes, no tax increases," which is quite a dangerous thing for a politician to promise, given the changing circumstances that politicians face, at least not the US president. Pat Buchanan then took that phrase as part of his campaign and essentially argued, "Read my lips, no second term." So it really did come back to bite George Bush, and indeed Bill Clinton adopted that phrase, "Read my lips, no second term," for George Bush Sr., and to a certain extent it worked, because he didn't get that second term, only a one-term president. Another example of an act of political self-harm, Clinton versus Bernie Sanders. So this progressive insurrection which has occurred in the Democratic Party versus the more establishment figure of Hillary Clinton in 2016, and there was an argument that actually Bernie should win. He's got a good chance of winning, because if you don't allow him to win, it is going to be Bernie or bust, and so it later proved. There is an argument to be said that Bernie Sanders, as being a more left-wing candidate than Hillary Clinton, would have actually been a greater contrast even against Donald Trump. So if you had Donald Trump tearing off to the right, Bernie Sanders going to the left, that may have served as a better battleground for the Democrats to actually win. We'll never know, of course, it's speculation, but Bernie or bust was a kind of emphasis for that particular slugfest in 2016 between Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And most startlingly, Donald Trump, the man of arguably the most effective political put-downs. He doesn't hold back, does he, the Donald? Calling Marco Rubio, who really has been a growing star in the Republican Party, Little Marco. Now, I'm only 5'6", so, you know, that's quite wounding for me. Marco Rubio is, I don't think, anywhere near as small as me, and yet that really did work as a bit of a put-down against Marco Rubio. Donald Trump is about 6'3", I think, so Marco Rubio, not necessarily a small guy like my good self, probably around about 5'10", 5'11". He's not struck me as a particularly small guy, and yet Donald Trump seemed to tower over him. Who says that stature doesn't matter in politics? So it was quite wounding for so-called Little Marco Rubio. Lying Ted, that was an accusation that Donald Trump used against Ted Cruz, one of his most kind of fierce political rivals in the 2016 contest. All these examples are from 2016, of course they are. That's when Donald Trump achieved the nomination. Lying Ted, arguing that Donald Trump would argue that Ted Cruz just couldn't tell the truth, and it really kind of stuck. And then Low Energy Jeb Bush, the brother of George Bush Jr. Real insider candidate, great contrast with the absolute outsider candidate of Donald Trump, Low Energy Jeb. And you know what? Jeb Bush, he wasn't as charismatic, love him or loathe him, as Donald Trump. So again, achieving a bit of a cut through. And I don't think any of those politicians, whether it's Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz or Jeb Bush, have ever forgiven Donald Trump. It may come back to haunt Donald Trump, politically speaking, in the future. We will see. But hey, it allowed him to achieve the nomination in 2016. Low turnout, also the primaries, whatever the contest really, no matter where it takes place, they do suffer from a low turnout. It arguably adds to the weight of democratic overload that voters can feel in the United States, constant electioneering that takes place in the US, that causes voters to be fatigued by yet another election. And, well, this figure is quite interesting, a 30% high in 2008. We did say that turnout has increased as an advantage, but we should put that into context. It's still low at only a 30% high in 2008. Typically speaking, the turnout in a primary contest is around about 20%, so it is low. Most Americans, they just aren't interested. So arguably, should we have these contests in the first place? The voters that do turn up to take part in the primaries, they are unrepresentative voters. They are part of the political landscape in terms of the core of the Republican and Democrat parties. They love their politics. They're the people who are happy to engage, but because of that, they tend to be more right-wing or indeed left-wing, respectively, for the Democrat or Republican parties when compared with the wider US electorate. And that means it does skew the presidential race. So if you're a Republican or Democrat candidate, you have to veer off to the left or the right to pick up these core supporters as part of the primary protest. And then really what many candidates tend to do is scramble back towards the centre ground to try and appeal to the wider US electorate. But arguably, you've already cooked your chicken, if you like, by being rather right-wing or being rather left-wing when it comes to achieving the nomination. You can't essentially promise something to the more loyal core supporters of the Republican and Democrat parties and then just completely ignore it when it comes to the November presidential election. So it does skew the presidential race and arguably skews the political landscape in the United States worryingly further to the left or further to the right, depends upon your political point of view. The caucuses themselves, I know there are a few of them, but they are rather antiquated. Some people argue that's quite endearing, but they can turn into farcical contests. So in caucuses, you have to rely on speakers who act on behalf of the candidates themselves, who essentially sell the candidate to a packed room. Arguably, is that the best way to choose a chosen candidate? Based on someone who's speaking on their behalf. Also, in the Democratic caucuses, they often move around the room and the votes are counted according to where people stand. It all looks a little bit messy and you're trying to count heads. A bit antiquated, bit old-fashioned. Again, some people find it endearing, depends on your point of view. But a new level of farce was perhaps arrived at in the Democratic Iowa caucus in 2020. They tried to make, God bless them, the caucus more accessible to as many voters as possible, and they actually employed the services of an app-making company to allow caucus goers to vote using the app. But it suffered technical problems, and then the official result was known some days after the actual caucus had taken place. And that leads to all sorts of suspicion and allegation. And lo and behold, it always happens in these sorts of somewhat murky situations. The contest turned out to be quite close, a bit like the hanging chats in the 2000 presidential election in Florida. Why would it have to be a close contest when it's not exactly been a smooth operation? Such is life. Caucuses and primaries also involve voters only in an indirect way. And I think I've really covered this when I've mentioned that it's essentially a form of direct democracy. But is it really? Because you are voting for a candidate, but in fact, you're actually awarding delegates to go and vote for a candidate at the convention. So it's not true direct democracy. And delegates occasionally do go rogue at the convention and ignore the wishes of their states. They should be pledged delegates, but they kind of unpledge themselves, uncommit themselves, and vote according to who they want. They're few and far between. They don't impact who actually is the eventual winner, but it really is counteracting the so-called direct democracy that really the primaries purport themselves quite often to be. And finally, in terms of a disadvantage, unsuitable candidates, they are not weeded out. Again, depends on your political persuasion here. I'm not going to offer you my point of view. It's merely an example as to whether Trump, I'm raising the question, was he a suitable candidate to become president? I actually in 2016 said to my students, yeah, it's just hype. Trump will blow over. He'll be found out during the primaries process, and he wasn't. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a bad thing. I'll leave it up to you to decide. Although he did face impeachment twice. So, you know, there's a strong argument that arguably he wasn't a suitable candidate to be the US president. Well, what about reforms? If we have slated the primaries and the caucuses and the primaries process as a whole, what should we have as plausible alternatives? Well, I do think that they are out there. How about randomise the running order? So you don't have necessarily Iowa and New Hampshire always going first. Put all the states into a random selector in a computer, or draw names out of a hat, a bit like a Football World Cup draw, and then that will be the running order. Very random and seemingly fair. And it would change the dynamics of the race each and every presidential election year. Why not? Adds to the excitement, if you like. If you're not going to go for that, though, you could go for the suggested Delaware plan, and it allows smaller states to go first. So there are some significant, economically and politically speaking, states in the US. Your California, your New York State, your Texas. They've got all enormous political, social capital, economic capital, of course. How about you get those states to go towards the end of the contest and allow the smaller states to have their moment in the political sun? Why not? So that's the Delaware plan, which you could have. Or alternatively, just hold a national ballot on a single point in time. Have the candidates for the Republicans, have the candidates for the Democrats, and then voters can select their chosen candidate at a single point in time, rather like a conventional election. Much more straightforward, probably cheaper as well, quite frankly, and all done and dusted in a relatively short period of time. Why not? Advantages and disadvantages. Well, the advantages, whether they outweigh the disadvantages, I'll let you decide, but probably the system as it is at the moment is more advantageous than before the McGovern-Fraser reforms kicked in. So it's better now, perhaps, arguably, than it was pre-early 1970s. But that said, is it a perfect system? I think few would argue that it is, given the number and perhaps the weight of the disadvantages that we've gone through. Hope that was useful for you guys. Thanks for watching, and I would just point out there are references in terms of the source material that I've used for this particular video in the video description, so check it out if you wish. Thank you very much.